Okay. So Andrew Spaeth is the facilitator for the Wasco County Forest Collaborative and the Hood River Forest Collaborative. He also works as an environmental planner with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. Andrew previously worked for Sustainable Northwest, which is based in Portland. And during his time there, he worked with forest collaboratives across the Pacific Northwest region. He's a graduate of Oregon State, where he studied public policy, collaborative governance, and forestry. And he is also a resident here in Hood River County. So Andrew, thanks for being here, and take it away.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks to Chuck and Cindy for the gracious invitation. I moved to Hood River County in 2018 and have been attending these Watershed group meetings since then. And it's a real honor to be able to share some of my work with you and the work of our local forest collaborative group. So really appreciate the invitation. I'm going to start my presentation by talking more generally about forest collaboratives, kind of why they emerged as a form of governance, forest governance, and especially with the focus on public lands management. I'll then talk a little bit about how some of our local forest collaborative groups are organized, some of the projects that we've been working on, and I'll share some kind of recent success stories and happenings amongst the two collaboratives here in the Gorge on the Oregon side. And then I'll finish by talking about what we're looking forward to, some of the things we plan to focus on in 2022 and beyond, and some of the science and recent information that's going to be used by the collaboratives to help inform some of our decision making and work together in the next year. So. All right, are you seeing my next slide? Great, thanks, Chuck. Yeah, so I was born in 1987, and so I did not live through the number of you probably live firsthand and can tell the story better than I can. And so I'm not going to try to go into details. Obviously, there's a lot out there about what happened and why, but I think the, kind of the thumbnail version of it from my perspective as it relates to forest collaboratives is that we had overharvested public lands and private lands really across the board. Estimates are that we cut between 90 and 95% of all old growth in the Pacific Northwest region. And we were learning, especially through the 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s, there were a number of species that were dependent on old growth and that were suffering and may likely be headed towards extinction if we didn't do something different. And so the northern spotted owl was, really kind of the face per se of that movement, and led to Al Gore and Bill Clinton coming out to Portland and the creation of the Northwest Forest Plan in 1994. But really an incredible amount of controversy and litigation associated with public lands and national forest system lands projects that pretty much halted, logging and economic activity that many of our communities had become dependent on. So we saw rampant, unemployment, 15, 16 or more % unemployment at the height of the timber industry or timber wars. Loss of about 48,000 jobs were some of the estimates from the time. So really devastating for a lot of rural communities and a real kind of represented, I think, a real fundamental shift in public lands management, the focus of restoration activities and timber management activities since. What emerged from all of that conflict, beginning in the state as early as 1992, was the emergence of these diverse groups of stakeholders called forest collaboratives that were really coming together around the idea that triple bottom line outcomes, social, ecological, economic benefits were possible if and so how we kind of define what a forest collaborative is, and as this has become a more common and kind of mainstream approach to forest governance, what does this look like? So Emily Jane Davis, who also lives in our backyard here in the gorge, and Dr. Anna Santo. They're some of the leading experts on this work actually in the region. And they define a forest collaborative as these groups of multiple stakeholders that meet on a regular basis for dialogue on kind of priorities on a given area of national forest system lands. The groups are typically made up of pretty diverse interests and are often focused on public lands, but not exclusively. So this is a map showing kind of the geographic distribution of forest collaboratives in Oregon today. The places where they're kind of a solid color, those are public lands collaboratives, or groups that are really focused on national forest system. The outlined areas are what are called all lands collaboratives, or groups that are really focused on kind of cross-boundary work and coordinating activities, not only with the Forest Service, but helping to implement projects or plan work across state, private, or other ownerships. One of the interesting things about us here in the Gorge and our two collaboratives is that here's the Hood River Ranger District, and our Hood River Forest Collaborative is a public lands collaborative. It's really been historically focused on the management of the Hood River Ranger District and working with our Forest Service partners. And just, east of us, our Wasco County Forest Collaborative is an all lands group that's got a slightly different focus and has been working across all lands. As I said, the first collaborative was established down here in Southwest Oregon in 1992, the Applegate Partnership. We really saw a tremendous increase in the number of forest collaboratives in the region beginning around 2010. I think around 2010, there were maybe 10 collaboratives in Oregon, and so another 16 groups have been established since then. It's my understanding there actually may be one or two more collaboratives that are in the process of being formed on the Stateholder National Forest, and so that number may go up. Most of these forest collaborative groups have some type of a charter or a document that establishes membership. So, they all pretty much have a mission statement or value statements that focus on this idea of achieving, these triple bottom line goals, engaging the community, pursuing ecological uplift and benefits associated with their work, and providing jobs and economic activities in the communities that they're serving. So collaboratives are actually not that dissimilar from watershed councils and watershed groups in terms of some of the key activities that their staff are engaged in. So most of the collaboratives have a facilitator or a coordinator or both. They also often are focused on monitoring and adaptive management, trying to learn from the projects that are implemented and figuring out how we implement and try to utilize the information that we're gaining from our monitoring work into future management activities. Some of them, I would say a small subset of them, are engaged in active research projects with academics, and then a number of the groups are also engaged in community outreach, trying to connect with their community partners and share information and solicit input from the general public. Funding for collaboratives is, on an annual basis between 2013 and 2018, ranged from about $7,000 to $150,000. So collaboratives in general do not have large budgets or large staff. Most of them maybe have one staff or less than a full FTE. There were about, I think it was 5 collaboratives that had annual budgets in this period over $100,000, and most of those groups had that additional funding as a result of being designated a collaborative forest landscape restoration project. It's a national competitive funding program that provided 10 years of funding to accelerate the implementation of projects on national forest system lands. There were 23 pilot projects that were selected in 2010. And we're actually seeing the expansion of that program and some additional new projects being added. But they received some funding for monitoring work in particular, but also some of the facilitation and coordination work that they were doing. Here in Oregon, we're really lucky to have the Oregon Department of Forestry include in their annual budget request each year funding for the Federal Forest Restoration Program. One of kind of the key programs within the FFRP is their collaborative capacity grants, which are actually administered by the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And they provide the majority of funding for forest collaboratives in Oregon. The survey that was associated with this working paper that Emily Jane and Dr. Santo put together found that was the single kind of most important source for groups in the state. So this is a list of some of the entities that are involved here locally in our forest collaborative efforts. We've been really fortunate to have I think really great number of different kind of real broad diversity of groups that aren't present in all the forest collaboratives across the state. Some parts of the state really don't have robust kind of timber industry presence. We have both private industrial landowners and mill owners that are participating in our process. We have, I think, excellent representation from the environmental community with both BARC and Oregon Wild participating. A lot of our state agencies and federal agencies have really leaned into the process, and our, Cindy and Alex have been great partners in all that as well. We're also really fortunate. A lot of tribes are not as active in forest collaboratives, but we're fortunate to have some of the natural resource staff from the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs who both kind of been presenters and provided kind of expert opinion and advice to the Hood River Forest Collaborative, and then one of our appointed members on the Wasco group is works for the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs. As forest cloud, this kind of more way in which the Forest Service and other groups are planning wildfire risk reduction projects. They've gotten notoriety in the media. So this is, I love Oregon Field Guide. This was a great 10-minute piece, What Happens When Loggers and Environmentalists Work Together. It focuses on the story of the Blue Mountain Forest Partners in Eastern Oregon on the Malheur National Forest. There's also a really excellent piece that I would encourage folks to look into, which is a podcast called Timber Wars. It was produced by Aaron Scott and Northwest Public Broadcasting, and it's just a really detailed and excellent kind of history of the Timber Wars and kind of the state of forestry in Oregon today, which I encourage folks to, you're interested in these topics. I thought it was really well done and pretty interesting piece. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of in more detail our local forest collaboratives and some of the things that we talked about here. I wanted to give a shout out as part of this slide to one of our founding members of the Hood River Forest Collaborative, one of 3 founding members, Rick Reagan, who's with us today. Shout out to Rick for being involved in the group now for more than a decade and really providing a lot of leadership to the group over time. And then our newest signatory on the Forest Collaborative is also here, Gary Asbridge. So we're really excited to welcome Gary into the collaborative and have him involved. He's been a wealth of knowledge and really helpful already. So membership of our Forest Collaborative is based on, it's a voluntary open thing. Anybody who's interested can participate in our meetings. In order to have kind of quote unquote voting rights, if you want to participate in the decision-making process, you have to be, you have to basically commit to working in line with our operating charter. And that charter outlines kind of our set of core principles, our mission statement, which is included here, and some of the collaborative behaviors and kind of ways in which we're going to try to work together to build consensus and find solutions to the issues that we're working on. So if you're willing to sign off on that and attend our meetings, you're part of the club. So we try to welcome anybody and everybody that's interested in being involved. The collaborative's worked on 4 projects with the Forest Service since the inception of the group. some of you may be familiar with where those projects are located based on your knowledge of the watershed and some of the other work that the Watershed group is leading. The most recent project was the Waukoma Huckleberry Enhancement Project, which I'm going to talk about in more detail later on. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that I think that many folks may know that the Forest Service has really seen a decline in capacity and funding for personnel over the last number of years. They actually currently have what's called a headcount cap and have limitations on the number of staff that they're able to have on the forest, and there's a lot of vacancies. And anyway, when Janine Turbo, our last district ranger, retired, the forest actually moved to a joint district ranger model. So both the Hood River and Barlow Ranger districts in Wasco County, we have basically one district ranger, kind of the primary lead for the districts, and then we have what's called NEPA interdisciplinary planning team. So pretty capacity constrained, and as a result, the collaboratives have adapted their approach and moved to this kind of joint model where we actually have just one fiscal sponsor with the Wasco County Soil and Water Conservation District, and shared facilitation, shared note taking, and then it also saves us a little on overhead because we just we write grants and pursue funding together as one group. So the Wasco County Forest Collaborative is different than the Hood River Group in a few ways. I talked a little bit about kind of the all lands and public lands focus, but actually, I think one of the most unique aspects of our Wasco County is that there are 11 steering committee members. Those steering committee members represent a specific interest. So there's a state agency position, a watershed resource position, an environmental group position, timber industry position, tribal representation position, and each of those seats are appointed by our Wasco County Board of Commissioners. So it's actually really fostered a great working relationship between the county and our forest collaborative. I think it gives the county a certain kind of sense of ownership and helping kind of guide and direct participation and engagement. We have a board of commissioner that attends all of our meetings, and I think especially given the historic role that national forests played in providing revenue and funds to counties, it's kind of been a cool evolution to see how the county has really learned a lot through the process and how I think empathetic they've become to the challenges associated with managing public lands. The group on the Wasco side, on the Barlow Ranger District, has worked on a number of projects. Many of these were just planned in the last few years, or we're wrapping up the planning process on. And I'll show you a map here that kind of will give you a better visual of where these are here in just a second. So these are some of the highlights I'm going to walk through. I'm just going to say a few words about a few of them that I think are noteworthy, but I didn't put together a slide, or I'm going to kind of talk about it in detail. So one that I'm not going to talk much more about is the White River Fire Salvage Project. Post-fire salvage has historically one of the more controversial issues as it relates to national forest system. As you may recall, in 2020, the White River Fire started in August, kind of mid-August of that year, burned about 17,000 acres across federal and private lands, and the White River Wildlife Refuge, or game refuge. The Forest Service approached the Wasco County Forest Collaborative about, could there be potential social agreement among the group to put together a salvage project, be limited to 250 acres. And the group worked with the Forest Service to basically identify and develop some criteria, select some units where salvage would be appropriate, and that decision memo was signed, and the project is going to be sold here next year. So in that case, there actually is some opportunities for kind of ecological uplift. We're partnering with ODF and W to do some replanting, create some pollinator habitat, some high quality early cereal habitat. we're also providing some economic opportunity associated with the harvesting and salvage of the material. One of the other things I'm not going to go into much detail about, but again, I think deserves mentioning, is the use of some of the new categorical exclusions that have come out of Congress in the last few years. So one of those is called the insect disease CE. It allows for up to 3,000 acres of harvest in areas that are designated by the regional forester and the governor's office. It requires collaboration, which is pretty cool of a CE category to require collaborative input and community engagement in that way. It requires the retention of large trees and has a number of other kind of ecological sideboards on it. We've planned 3 insect disease projects now on the Barlow Ranger District through the collaborative group, and all of those have really been helpful in trying to accelerate the dry forest restoration and wildfire risk reduction, as well as improve drought resilience and reduce the potential for insect disease outbreaks in that high priority part of the forest, kind of near Wamak Sportsman's Park area. The last one that I'll talk about here just briefly is plantation thinning zones agreement. The Hood River Forest Collaborative has worked together over the last year to flesh out agreements that are aimed at accelerating kind of future planning processes and helping to share with the Forest Service what our values and interests and concerns are associated with potential future plantation thinning projects. So it was a really rich experience. I think folks learned a lot as part of that process. So this map is kind of intended, and I hope the orientation isn't challenging. I had to flip it on its side to make it hopefully mostly readable. But this is Mount Hood. So for those of you who are involved or familiar, that's been going on in the Ranger District, this was the Units Vict. This is the Palali Cooper project. Waukoma is up here where the legend is. And then our next project that's potentially going to be planned on the Hood River Ranger District is currently being referred to as this 4410 fuel break. So it's an area the Forest Service and others have identified as basically being at high risk of transmitting wildfire from the Highway 35 corridor up into and towards kind of the Dalles watershed. And so this was an area that the Forest Service has identified because of some of the capacity constraints. They don't anticipate actually completing the planning of this project until 2026. So we got a bit of time to learn more about the project area and spend some time in the field gathering data and the like. The other thing I point out, so this was the footprint 17,000 acre White River fire that occurred in 2020, August of 2020. And then this brown outline, which is what I'm going to talk about next, is the location of our what's called our Central Wasco County Joint Chiefs Initiative. So the Joint Chiefs Initiative is a competitive grant program that's administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Forest Service, and NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service. It's really focused on fostering the implementation of cross-boundary restoration treatments and treatments that can reduce risk of wildfire affecting homes, community infrastructure, important factors. So there's 3 years of funding that's been dedicated to this project on the east zone of the Mount Hood. The amount of funding has ramped up each year. For FY22, I think we're expecting about $1.5 million to do work on both Forest Service and adjacent and state wildlife refuge lands. This is going to fund a lot of pine oak restoration, which is really high priority in the area. And then thin out some of these kind of old plantations and stands, like the one that you're seeing in the photo here, which is a ponderosa pine kind of stand on the edge of the public-private land boundary within the Joint Chiefs area. We also just applied for another Joint Chiefs project that would be in kind of North Wasco County and cover the area around the Dalles watershed. exciting project to work on next. I mentioned the Wacomo Huckleberry project. This is the recent project we worked on here on the Hood River Ranger District. Really exciting learning opportunity for the group. The archaeologists on the Mount Hood National Forest shared an excellent presentation with us, and we learned a lot about how important Wacomo Ridge was historically for huckleberry gathering and processing. So that was, really insightful. Historically, these areas were maintained using fire to, basically create openings and maintain openings and that huckleberry habitat. The project was also a partnership with the Warm Springs Tribe, which the 3 previous projects that we had worked on the Hood River side here didn't really have a lot of tribal engagement. So we were able to learn from tribal natural resources staff who gave us a presentation and shared how they manage for huckleberry on the reservation. And then the Forest Service organized a field trip with 17 tribal elders and tribal natural resources staff to also learn about cultural use, historic use, and some of the tribal priorities related to this planning area. In total, we'll see about 2,500 acres treated on Wacomo Ridge. About 500 acres are shelterwood treatments that have some larger openings that'll be created. And then about 2,000 acres are kind of various thinning with, sapling thinning, intermediate, PCT. One of the other kind of, I think, really cool aspects of this project is that the Forest Service and the collaborative are invested heavily in monitoring the outcomes and huckleberry production in particular over time. So for the last 2 field seasons, Forest Service has had their botanist and area ecologist and field staff, seasonal staff out there establishing plots and collecting baseline data. And then implementation is anticipated to begin sometime later this year, probably it's summer or fall of this year. And so we'll be able to start collecting some post-implementation monitoring data. But of course, it'll be a few years before the huckleberry fields are really restored, and there's some good picking up there. So one of the other kind of recent successes and something that we're really excited about, we were just given about $40,000 grant from Oregon Department of Forestry for a technical assistance and science support grant, it's called. So this is to conduct a fire history study in Hood River and Wasco counties on National Forest System lands. So the gentleman on the screen here, his name is Dr. Andrew Merschel. He's a professor and research scientist at the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. And he's done a number of these studies across the Northwest. As folks may or may not know, there's really kind of broad scientific consensus around the need to conduct, thinning and reintroduce fire in our dry forest ecosystems. As collaboratives and really within the science community, there's a lot of different opinions about the role that fire historically played in moist mixed conifer forests and cold forest types. So Andrew's research is gonna establish a plot design in our 4410 fuel break planting area that I highlighted, and then one area on the Barlow. He's gonna go out and find either stumps or short snags that he can take a cross section of, and then he'll date those, and he will reconstruct the historic role of basically fire occurrence and the fire return interval in those stands. And so he's conducted this same type of research across a number of forests now, the Rum River Siskiyou, the Umpqua, the Deschutes, the Ochiko, in these kind of higher elevation and moist forest types. And consistently what he's been finding is that the fire return interval in those forests is more like 30 to 50 years, which is significantly less than what a lot of scientists have been suggesting. Kind of a contemporary view is that moist mixed conifer forests and cold forests burn at high severity every 100 to 200 years in kind of our neck of the woods. So this research really suggests that historically, especially pre-European settlement, fire played a much more active role in even those kind of cooler and moister forests, and probably significantly altered and shaped the structure, composition, and function of those forest ecosystems. So especially in the face of climate change and anticipated, hotter, drier conditions, this is pretty cool research because it gives us both a lens into kind of what growth was like when, what happened when there were droughts, but also this need to probably reintroduce some disturbance into forest types if we want to maintain some of the function and species composition that we have today. So what else are we looking forward to in 2022? So I talked a little bit about the fire history study. Wildfire is on everybody's mind, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that the collaborative's been thinking about related to wildfire. I think we've had plans to try to better engage with the community. COVID's been a challenge, but we've got some renewed emphasis and some thoughts around that. And then really hoping to lean in on monitoring. So our work with the Forest Collaborative, similar to the Watershed group, is really to try to be science-based. And so I'm not sure how much of the science around kind of forest ecology and wildfire is getting out. And so I thought, what a great opportunity to maybe summarize some of the key papers and recent research that I think the Forest Collaborative is, basically identified and that we'll be using to inform some of our work ahead. So in 2018, a group called Pyrologics, which is a group of researchers based in Montana, was hired by the Forest Service to produce the quantitative wildfire risk assessment for Oregon and Washington. It's a modeling effort that includes data for 28 different resource values, house structure, historic sites, pretty much everything, salmon habitat, owl habitat, and the like. And so what they do is they basically model out a number of different fire scenarios, thousands of fire scenarios. And for each of those, they evaluate whether or not the outcomes associated with the fire based on current vegetation conditions and kind of a diverse range of fire burning conditions, what the outcome will be to that particular resource value. And it can be negative, right? You could have negative outcomes associated with fire, or you could have benefits ecological benefits associated with fire. And interestingly, if you look at the results of overall wildfire risk for the state of Oregon, there's a huge red area, this kind of very high and high wildfire risk, or basically big negative outcomes associated with fire, that occur in Southwest Oregon. You see another big patch kind of around Bend, but this collection of basically high and very high risk sub-watersheds in Hood River and Wasco counties is basically the third largest concentration of bad outcomes associated with fire in our state. So it should be, I think, pretty alarming for folks. If you've been paying attention to some of the fires that we've seen in recent years, obviously Eagle Creek, but even just this last year, the fires that could have easily burned down portions of the Dalles, Lyle, White Salmon, it's with the wind we get and the number of human fire starts that we have, it can be pretty scary. So obviously lightning isn't always a big issue here, but a lot of fire starts. So in 2019, there are 312 known fire starts in Hood River County. 81.4% of all of those were human caused. So, I think as a group, as we think about what can we do to better prepare the community for wildfire, this is certainly a data point in our community engagement and outreach, trying to really emphasize in partnership with fire districts and ODF and others that, we need people to put their campfires out. Motor vehicles are obviously a source. Power lines are a source. Pile burning is one of the main sources of some of these fire starts. So opportunities, hopefully, for some education outreach and reducing risk of fire, especially during the peak fire season. Just last week, one of the other things we're paying attention to and thinking about, so just last week, the USDA Forest Service at the national level put out their wildfire crisis strategy. We've got I think there's a fire burning in California, not far from where Alex's family is. Hopefully they're okay and doing well, but you know, we've obviously seen outcomes associated with fires continue to get worse, and the expenses associated with firefighting, you know, just dramatically increased over the last few decades. So, of this process, Forest Service identified three main reasons for the current crisis. One is the buildup of hazardous fuels. The second is climate change, and the third issue that's really driving a lot of this is the expansion of human development, building of homes, and infrastructure in the wildland-urban interface near the forest or in the forest. They also conducted a prioritization process where they identified places where they'd like to see additional investments in treatments, and interestingly, pretty well in line with the quantitative wildfire risk assessment, right? We see this in Block in Southwest Oregon, and then in Gorge River, Wasco counties in the east zone of the Mount Hood National Forest. So it's great to see, I think in some respects, that there's recognition and the Forest Service committing to taking action and doing something about the problem. Their goal is to treat 50 million acres in the next 10 years in these priority firesheds. So pretty ambitious and lots of work to do, but it's likely that the infrastructure funding is going to be at least in part tied to some of this. The last thing I wanted to just talk a little bit about in terms of the science we're paying attention to and things we're thinking about and grappling with in the collaborative. Scientists from the University of Washington, Oregon State University, the Pacific Northwest Research Lab, and others recently published a climate vulnerability assessment for the Mount Hood National Forest. This is amazingly comprehensive, covers pretty much all natural resource areas from watershed resources, wildlife, discussion of carbon, vegetation, recreation, everything in between. So I just tried to pull some of the relevant stuff for vegetation. If you haven't read the document, I'm happy to. I've embedded a hyperlink in my presentation here, and would encourage folks to go check out the sections that are most relevant to your areas of interest. The report breaks down kind of the vegetation section by these general forest types. And I just summarized here and basically pulled quotes from the document that talk about what some of the impacts are going to be. Pretty much across all forest types, the researchers are anticipating that we're going to see more disturbance. In other words, more wildfire, more drought-related impacts, and more insect and disease outbreaks in pretty much every forest type. They may be especially pronounced in some of the dry forest ecosystems. I think trying to think about how we adapt and mitigate some of the potential negative effects associated with that is an important strategy. Our moist mix conifer forests, as a result of some of those disturbances, we're going to probably see some of our drought intolerant species, western hemlock, Pacific silver fir, western red cedar, some of the examples here, decrease in abundance, which will likely, that loss of species diversity and kind of reduction of the stand density and canopy layering will certainly affect some wildlife that depend on those conditions. In our cold forest ecosystems, wildfire and other disturbances is likely to lead to a massive reduction in subalpine species across the Mount Hood. A lot of those forests have already been impacted by white pine blister rust, especially obviously in the white bark pine, and there could be kind of invasion of some other insects, especially as we see, the shift from more of kind of a snow-dominated system to a rain-dominated precipitation system. One of the other ways they categorize this is by special habitats, and they specifically mention oak woodlands, which is, in our local group, East Cascades Oak Partnership, has obviously been doing a great job on, the oak woodlands are highly fragmented, largely as a result of some, human-related development, really. But interestingly, the oak woodlands, and maybe not surprisingly, may be better off with a hotter, drier climate, especially if we can reduce some of the conifer encroachment that's occurred in those forest types, so that when fire does occur, it has kind of a more characteristic and low severity fire effect. Here's what the map of that looks like, and the colors in this may be too small to read. I'm not sure how large your screen is, but I guess I'd just point out a couple of things. So here's mode, and so we're seeing basically, as I suggested, as the researchers suggested, right, by 2080, almost completely, elimination of our subalpine forests. Interestingly, on the west side of the Cascades, we see the emergence of this forest type that the researchers refer to as a warm mixed conifer condition. So it'll be interesting to see. There's a better description in the paper about kind of how species composition is going to shift as a result. And then obviously, expansion in some areas of our moist mixed conifer forest, and then everything, just kind of slightly moving up the hill, but again, that dry forest probably maintaining most of its current kind of geographic extent. Some of the lower elevation stuff, if there's high severity fire, may shift to kind of a grassland, shrubland, at least for some kind of extended period of time. So one of the researchers who shared all this alarming information suggests we do about it. So in general, they're offering that reducing density, reducing competition among trees, really trying to maintain and enhance some of the backbones of resilience in our forests. So those big old ponderosa pine, large Doug fir, western larch species that are going to be more drought tolerant and more fire tolerant in the future, pretty much across all elevations and aspects, is going to be an important strategy. Diversity is obviously one of our best tools in terms of preparing for climate change and adapting to future conditions, and then really thinking about how do we manage for, I think the real challenge, and they talk about this in the paper to some extent, is how do you manage for current threatened and endangered species that rely on that type of habitat, and how do you kind of strike a balance between the need to adapt and prepare forest ecosystems for a hotter, drier climate and the increased risk of disturbance, while still trying to give some of those species a chance. So it's something I know our group is going to be struggling with, the Forest Service will be grappling with, and other partners will be thinking about. The final thing that I just found interesting about some of their findings, and I thought I'd highlight here because it's coming out more frequently within the context of our collaborative group, is kind of this idea of how do you balance timber supply and carbon sequestration, and what role do public lands play in mitigating the effects of climate change. Because of some of the disturbance events that we're likely to see occurring, it's unlikely that we're going to have higher productivity, that we're really going to be sequestering more carbon or producing more timber in the future. That's all subject to change, but the data from this report suggests that by 2100, under kind of a moderate climate change scenario, average annual temperatures will be probably about 4 degrees Celsius higher than they were in 1895. We've already seen about a 1.2 Celsius degree increase in this region. So, I think trying to find ways to mitigate the effects of climate change by reducing emissions, and storing carbon in trees is certainly a worthwhile pursuit. In these dry forest ecosystems where wildfire is really an inevitability and drought related mortality is going to be an inevitability, I think it really changes the narrative and should shift our thinking in terms of the need to prioritize adaptation and trying to maintain as much resilience in the landscape as possible, as opposed to trying to maximize carbon sequestration, which would probably really exacerbate the problem in a lot of places, especially in the American West. So that's what I've got for you, some food for thought. I hope that hit the mark in terms of what you were looking for, Cindy and Alex. And here's my contact information. We'd love to have you at a future collaborative meeting. Our group meets the second Thursday of every month, and we've of course been on Zoom for the last couple of years. So let me know, feel free to get in touch if you'd like to be on our email list or pop in for a future meeting. I'm happy to take some questions as well if there are any.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I know you have to leave in perhaps 6 minutes, but if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask Andrew, feel free to unmute and ask, and or you can add them in the chat box and I'll try to watch that and read that out as well.
Okay, so does anybody have a question? This is Chuck. In the short time Andrew has left with us.
I got a question. Andrew, I'm curious, just 2 questions really. One, hopefully really quick. When you gave the monetary values of what collaboratives, what their budgets were, I'm curious where the Hood River Collaborative falls in that, generally speaking. And then my second question, and this is pretty broad, what do you view as the key elements of collaborative success?
Yeah, our budget this last year for the Hood River and Wasco collaboratives combined was about $40,000. I think our budget will increase as a result of some of the recent grants that we've been successful in receiving. The ODF grant, we're going after some funding from DEQ, which has been really exciting, and a cool partnership that's emerged with the SWCD. So I think our budget and kind of the scope of activities that we're going to be involved in, adding research, trying to leverage some additional money for monitoring, will continue to go up slightly. So probably, I guess the Hood River would be, about half, $20,000 or $30,000 a year, probably. In terms of your second question, so there's this wonderful environmental attorney, Susan Jane Brown, in Portland, who works on these issues and she was a serial litigator for Forest Service for a long time, but is now probably the biggest proponent of collaboration in the region. And she says the key to successful collaboration is alcohol. But so I was half joking, but I think her point is that you really have to have some cohesion as a group. People have to jive. You have to be genuinely interested in who you're working with, what their kids are doing, what they ate for dinner last night. Just being empathetic and trying to understand somebody else's perspective and why they care about the things that they do, I think is very much missing in our world. But when it's present in collaboratives, people really care about each other. They want to find solutions and work towards. Yes, I think you really see a lot of success. I think the other thing I just mentioned is having science that is local in nature or is applicable to the area that you're working in, and that can really help the group grapple with some of the areas where there is contention or disagreement. I think science has the potential to play a really cool role in that space, and I think a lot of successful collaboratives have used science to help them navigate some of the harder things they've tried to tackle.
Thank you.
You did an amazing job of covering a lot of material in a really coherent way. I just want to express my appreciation for that. and all that you have done since you've become our Forest Collaborative Coordinator or Facilitator.
Thanks, Cindy. That means a lot.
Yeah, so go ahead, Emery.
Can I ask you a quick question, Andrew? I'm curious with kind of the climate modeling document that you were just referencing. How do you see the collaborative kind of acting upon that? Is it mostly in a planning context or in some other way as you kind of move forward in that work?
Emery, you cut out for me. I'm not sure if I got your whole question. Did anybody else hear that, or was it just me?
I'm happy to repeat it. I was just curious how the collaborative plans to address or kind of act upon the climate projections that you were referencing.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, to be honest, because we're operating in within kind of the context of a pretty rigid kind of political, law, regulation, and policy that dictates public lands management on the Mount Hood National Forest. Doesn't really even consider climate change at this point. So our forest plan was, I think, put together in 1990. The Northwest Forest Plan was developed in 1994. And so I think part of the challenge is thinking about how do we update and or amend some of those policies to really reflect the current science and enable us to be more adaptive in our management. I think part of our role potentially, and what I think the collaborative has started to do, is we've invited some of the scientists who wrote that assessment and others who have been focused on these topics to come share presentations with us and try to build kind of a better shared understanding among our group about who, basically about the science behind the effects of climate change, particularly on terrestrial systems. And so that's, I think, part of what we're thinking about. The big challenge, though, to be honest, I don't know if this is really what you were asking, but what your question makes me think about is that fundamentally, to adapt a lot of our forest ecosystems to climate change and hotter, drier conditions, we need to reduce stand densities. Like, we need to go thin out small trees, probably do some commercial activity. We need to reintroduce fire at a much larger scale. There are a lot of partners who aren't necessarily very excited about the idea of cutting more trees. And so how do we wrap our heads around this, like, really alarming data that's suggesting we have really high wildfire risk? A lot of the scientists are suggesting, right, that kind of understory thinning and prescribed burning is going to be a real way to build resilience back into the system and prepare our forests for fire. And then the general public isn't necessarily always there, is getting mixed messages sometimes about, what role forests should play in mitigating the effects of climate change and how effective that thinning really is. And so I think there's both kind of a science side of it, but there's also real public perception and kind of social dynamic associated with it that's complex.
Can I ask one quick follow-up question?
Yeah.
When you have a NEPA process, your next NEPA process that isn't going to kick off for 5 years or whatever that date is, I'm just curious. So is it just kind of sharing science and building understanding at this point then? Like, is there any action you can take besides NEPA engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Forest Collaborative is going to be talking about that at the meeting next month. We have done a little bit of strategic planning in the past, and one of the ideas that's emerged as a potential priority is developing some climate change zones of agreement, which would really try to help us kind of formalize what we're learning through that process of engagement and thinking about how do we help the Forest Service and other partners, basically try to adapt some of their approaches and engage them in the process of implementing actions that can mitigate the effects of climate change on our forest ecosystems. The other thing that's super exciting is that, and that I anticipate we'll probably work on, is Oregon Department of Forestry recently received a massive increase in their budget, and I think it was like $330 million that are being invested in various programs related to forest restoration, wildfire mitigation, and risk reduction work. And so we've been actually meeting with some of the local partners, including the county forester, the land trust, and the SWCD and the Watershed group and others, to brainstorm potential ideas to do restoration projects across boundaries, and think more kind of about an approach that could help us take advantage of some of the new state resources and likely some of the new federal resources that are becoming available, and trying to kind of identify and phase projects. Oregon Department of Forestry is also investing in planning capacity through their Good Neighbor Authority program. That's going to help us potentially plan projects on federal lands without having to hire additional federal workers. So we would actually use probably state crews or contracted crews that would help us produce NEPA analyses and do the, basically the surveying and the work to be able to implement projects faster. So that's something we're actively exploring as well, and really hopeful we're able to, I think especially in some of the dry mix conifer and those high priority areas on the east side of the valley, there's good pine oak restoration work to do. There's wildfire risk reduction work to do in the wildland urban interface. So I think that would be kind of low hanging fruit, to be honest, for our group. It would also be a great way for us to kind of add value to the work that the Forest Service is trying to accomplish as well.
Okay, keeping with Andrew's time frame, I want to say thank you for a great presentation, and I want the group to show their appreciation either by unmuting and clapping or some visual cue that Andrew has done a great job, at which I really agree with. So thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Okay.